This is something that should make you stop for a moment and think differently about everything you assume is obvious. Across history, the most brilliant minds humanity has produced: mathematicians, physicists, logicians. Philosophers have spent centuries constructing some of the most refined and carefully structured arguments for the existence of God. These were not casual ideas or emotional beliefs. They were formal systems of reasoning, built with precision, using logic itself as the foundation. And yet there is a strange tension hidden inside all of this. The very same tools that were used to build those arguments, logic, reason, mathematics, are also the tools that can quietly take them apart. It raises a difficult possibility. What if the instruments we trust to lead us toward truth are also the ones that reveal a completely different conclusion than the one we expected? Think about that for a moment. The weapon and the wound are the same thing. We are often told that if we follow reason far enough, it will eventually lead us to God. But what if honest reasoning, carried without interruption or exception, leads somewhere else entirely? What if the universe does not require anything beyond itself to explain its existence? And even more unsettling, what if the very idea that everything must have an explanation is not a feature of reality, but a limitation of how we think? That is the question we are going to explore. And it begins with something deeply human, a thought almost everyone has had at some point, maybe as a child lying in grass looking up at the night sky, or maybe in a quiet moment when everything around you suddenly feels still. The question appears almost on its own. Why is there something instead of nothing? For most of human history, the answer felt straightforward. Something must have made it. Something must have designed it. There had to be a cause, a creator, a mind behind reality itself. This intuition is not foolish or primitive. It is actually one of the most natural conclusions a thinking mind can reach. When we see a watch on the ground, we assume a watchmaker. When we see order and complexity in nature, the instinct to infer design feels almost unavoidable. This is why civilizations throughout history formed ideas of gods and later built entire philosophical systems around them. Eventually, those ideas were refined into formal logical arguments meant to prove God's existence with the same rigor as geometry. The cosmological argument says everything that exists has a cause. The universe exists, therefore the universe must have a cause, and that cause is God. The ontological argument claims that if we can conceive of the greatest possible being, then that being must exist in reality, because existence is greater than non-existence. The teleological argument points to the apparent design and order in nature, claiming that design implies a designer. These are not careless ideas. They come from some of the most powerful intellects in history. They were attempts to push reason as far as it could go. But here is where things begin to shift. As science and logic advanced, they started doing something unexpected. They began answering questions that were once thought to require a divine explanation. Slowly, quietly, without dramatic confrontation, gaps in our understanding began to close. And that leads to a difficult question that most people never ask properly. What happens if those gaps disappear completely? Because once you start looking closely, the debate is no longer just about evidence or scripture or personal belief. It becomes something deeper. It becomes about whether the very structure of these explanations actually works in the first place. And to understand that, we need to examine what it really means to explain anything at all. But before we get there, we have to start with how science itself began to reshape the idea of a beginning of the universe and why that changes everything that comes next. Because once we move beyond intuition and look at explanation carefully, something important becomes clear. An explanation is not just a statement that feels satisfying. It has a specific job. It takes something that seems mysterious or unlikely and shows how it arises from something simpler, more basic, or more fundamental. In other words, a real explanation reduces mystery instead of just naming it. This is what science does at its best. When Isaac Newton explained the motion of planets, he did not simply say, gravity exists. He gave a mathematical framework that allowed predictions, calculations, and deep understanding. It became possible to know where a planet would be in the future, not just wonder why it moves. Similarly, when Charles Darwin explained the complexity of life, he did not say it was designed and stop there. He described a process: variation, selection, and inheritance that slowly builds complexity over time without requiring intention. Life became understandable through a mechanism, not just a label. Now compare this with the typical explanation of God used in philosophical arguments. When asked why the universe exists, the answer becomes because God created it. But this immediately raises another question. Why does God exist? If complexity requires explanation, then a being capable of creating an entire universe seems to demand explanation even more urgently than the universe itself. And yet, in most arguments, God is declared exempt from that requirement. This creates a tension. If something can exist without explanation, then it is not clear why the universe itself cannot also exist without one. On the other hand, if everything must have an explanation, then God cannot be the final stopping point. So the explanation does not actually remove the mystery. It simply moves it one step back and wraps it in a different concept. This is where the argument begins to weaken, not through emotion, but through structure. At the same time, science has been progressing in a way that changes the entire landscape of this discussion. The modern scientific picture of the universe begins with the Big Bang. Around 13.8 billion years ago, the observable universe was in an extremely hot, dense state and began expanding. We have strong evidence for this model. The cosmic microwave background radiation, the redshift of distant galaxies, and the abundance of light elements like hydrogen and helium all point to a universe that evolved from an early, highly compressed state. This is often used to support the idea that the universe had a beginning and therefore must have a cause. But here is where interpretation becomes critical. In physics, a beginning does not necessarily mean what it means in everyday language. When equations like general relativity are pushed back in time, they reach a point where they stop working properly. This is called a singularity. But a singularity is not a confirmed moment of creation. It is a sign that our current models are incomplete. It is not an answer. It is a boundary. And at that boundary, new physics begins to appear. In quantum cosmology, there are models in which the universe can emerge from quantum states without requiring a classical cause. At the quantum level, the idea of a strict before the universe may not even be meaningful. If time itself begins with the universe, then asking what caused it before it began is like asking what is north of the North Pole. The question assumes a framework, time, and causality that may not apply. So already, the idea of a necessary external creator becomes less clear, not because it has been disproven, but because the question itself may be misformed. And this is where we transition into something even more fundamental, logic itself, and whether the classical arguments for God can survive when examined with strict consistency. Let's return to the classical arguments, but this time we will examine their internal structure more carefully. Take the cosmological argument. It begins with a simple claim. Everything that exists has a cause. From this it concludes that the universe has a cause, and that cause is God. At first glance, this feels coherent, but the moment we test it strictly, a problem appears. If everything that exists has a cause is truly universal, then it must apply to God as well. That means God would also require a cause. To avoid this, the argument introduces an exception. God is defined as uncaused or necessary. But the moment that exception is made, the original rule is no longer universal. The argument quietly changes its foundation to protect its conclusion. Now, the defender might respond that God is a necessary being, meaning God cannot fail to exist. The universe, in contrast, is contingent and could have been otherwise. But this introduces a deeper issue. What does it actually mean for something to be necessary in this context? How do we verify it? In practice, it becomes circular. God exists necessarily because God is defined as necessarily existing. This is not a discovery about reality. It is a definition that already contains its conclusion. The ontological argument attempts something even more abstract. It claims that existence is a property and that a maximally great being must possess all great properties, including existence. Therefore, God must exist. But this step is exactly where philosophers like Immanuel Kant identified the core issue. Existence is not a property like strength or intelligence. Saying something exists does not add a feature to its description. It simply says the concept is instantiated in reality. You cannot define something into existence. Otherwise, any perfectly defined object could be declared real just by definition. The teleological argument, or design argument, is perhaps the most intuitive. It says that the complexity of life implies a designer. For a long time, this felt compelling because biological systems appear structured, efficient, and purposeful. But Darwin's theory of evolution changed the framework entirely. Natural selection shows how complexity can arise from simple processes without foresight or intention. Variation, competition, and inheritance are enough to generate structures that look designed even though no design is involved. The eye, often cited as an example of irreducible complexity, turns out to be the result of gradual evolutionary steps, each one offering a survival advantage. There is no need to assume an instant complete design. So what we are left with is not a collapse of the questions, but a collapse of the assumption that design-like appearance requires a designer. Across all these arguments, a pattern emerges. They begin with strong intuitions about causality, necessity, and design. But when examined strictly, they either introduce exceptions, redefine terms, or shift the problem rather than solve it. And this leads to a deeper question. If these explanations do not truly explain, then what would a better explanation even look like? To explore that, we need to step away from abstract arguments and look at how explanation itself evolved in science, from substances to processes, from things to mechanisms that generate them. To understand this shift, imagine something simple. Imagine you have never encountered fire before. You have no concept of combustion, chemistry, or energy transfer. Now someone shows you a match striking and producing a flame. You try to explain what you are seeing using only intuition. It feels natural to assume there must be a fire substance inside the match that is released when it ignites. For most of history, humans actually believed something similar. The ancient theory of phlogiston suggested that burning objects released a hidden substance that explained fire. It seemed logical, complete, and satisfying. But it was wrong. As chemistry developed, we learned that fire is not a substance at all. It is a process, rapid oxidation, that releases energy. The flame is not a thing that exists independently. It is the visible result of countless molecular interactions happening in real time. Once this shift happened, understanding became deeper. Fire was no longer mysterious. It became predictable, controllable, and usable in engineering. This change represents a broader pattern in science. Explanations based on things are gradually replaced by explanations based on processes. Now apply this shift to the universe itself. For much of history, the explanation for existence followed the same structure as the fire example. There is a thing behind everything: God, a mind, an entity that causes reality to exist. This is a substance-style explanation of the universe. But modern science increasingly replaces this with process-based explanations. Gravity is not a hidden force sent from outside reality. It is the curvature of space-time. Life is not a vital essence injected into matter. It is chemistry shaped by selection over time. Consciousness is not a ghost placed inside the brain. It appears to emerge from complex information processing in neural networks. At every level, the pattern repeats. What once looked like a thing turns out to be a process. The deeper we go, the more reality appears structured by relationships, interactions, and mathematical laws rather than external agents. Physics takes this even further. At the level of everyday experience, we see objects and forces, but beneath that, we find fields, equations, and symmetries. These are not objects in the traditional sense. They are mathematical structures that describe how reality behaves. And when we go deeper still into quantum theory, the idea of fixed, solid reality begins to dissolve. Particles do not always have definite positions or properties until they are measured. Instead, they exist in states of probability described by wave functions. Even more strangely, at the level of quantum fields, empty space is not truly empty. It is a dynamic structure filled with fluctuations and temporary excitations that constantly appear and disappear. This changes how we think about nothing. What we call vacuum is not absence. It is a structured, active state with its own behavior. And this becomes important for a key philosophical claim, that the universe must have been created from nothing by an external cause. Because in physics, nothing is not what people usually imagine. And once that assumption changes, the necessity of an external creator becomes far less clear. At this point, the discussion is no longer just about belief. It is about whether the framework of things that must be caused by other things is even the right way to describe reality at its deepest level. Once we stop treating reality as a collection of fixed things and start seeing it as a network of processes, the entire structure of the argument changes again. Because now the question is no longer just what caused the universe, but whether causality itself is the right concept to apply at the deepest level of reality. To see why, we need to zoom back out and look at what modern physics actually reveals when it is taken seriously across all scales. At the level of everyday experience, the world looks solid and familiar. Objects move, forces act, and events unfold in a clear sequence of cause and effect. Newton's laws describe this world with precision, and for centuries it was enough to assume that this level of reality was fundamental. But as physics advanced, each layer beneath this everyday world revealed something more abstract and less intuitive. Electromagnetism, described by Maxwell's equations, replaced invisible pushes and pulls with fields that exist everywhere in space. Einstein's relativity replaced absolute space and time with a flexible geometry where space and time are part of the same structure, shaped by mass and energy. Each step did something important. It removed the need for hidden agents or external controllers and replaced them with mathematical relationships that govern behavior from within the system itself. Then quantum mechanics pushed this even further. At the quantum level, reality stops behaving like a collection of definite objects. Instead, it behaves like a system of probabilities. Particles do not always have fixed properties before measurement. They exist in superpositions, multiple possible states described by a wave function. This is not just philosophical interpretation, it is the working structure of the most accurate physical theory humanity has ever built. And within this framework, events such as radioactive decay do not have a specific deterministic cause in the classical sense. They happen probabilistically, without a hidden mechanism determining the exact moment of occurrence. This challenges a deep assumption behind many traditional arguments, that every event must have a definite cause in the classical sense. But physics does not fully support that assumption. Instead, it suggests that at the most fundamental level, nature is not built on rigid chains of cause and effect, but on probabilistic laws that define what can happen and how likely it is. And when we push even deeper into quantum field theory, the idea of empty space itself begins to break down. The vacuum is not truly empty. It is a dynamic structure filled with fluctuations, temporary excitations that appear and disappear constantly. In a sense, even nothing in physics has structure and behavior. This is where a major philosophical tension emerges. Many traditional arguments for a creator assume that the universe emerged from absolute nothingness. But physics does not describe nothing as a simple absence. It describes it as a structured quantum state with properties of its own. So the idea that something cannot come from nothing becomes far less straightforward than it initially appears. Because what we call nothing in everyday language may not exist in physics at all. And if that is the case, then one of the core premises behind the need for an external creator begins to weaken not through denial, but through redefinition of what reality actually is. At this point, the discussion shifts again. We are no longer just examining whether the universe has a cause. We are beginning to question whether cause is even the correct framework at the deepest level of physics. And that leads to a more radical possibility, that the universe is not something that was triggered by an external event at all, but something that is best understood as emerging from mathematical structure itself. To understand what that means, we now have to look at how far mathematics goes in describing reality and whether it might be more fundamental than the idea of a creator acting upon the universe. When we step back far enough, a striking pattern appears across all levels of physics. The deeper we go, the less reality looks like a collection of things, and the more it looks like a self-consistent mathematical structure. At the surface, we see objects, planets, trees, bodies, particles. But beneath that surface, physics replaces objects with equations. What we call things are increasingly understood as stable patterns within fields and interactions governed by mathematical laws. The laws themselves are not physical objects. They are relationships, structures that describe how quantities behave relative to each other. And this raises a profound question. Are these laws discovered, or are they describing something that exists independently of physical reality itself? Some physicists and philosophers have proposed a radical idea, that the universe is not something that happens to obey mathematics, but something that is mathematical in its very essence. On this view, what we call physical reality is a mathematical structure that exists necessarily, in the same way that mathematical objects exist independently of human invention. The number 7 does not require a cause. It is not created. It is defined by its place within a logical structure. Similarly, a consistent mathematical system does not need an external explanation for its existence. It simply is. If the universe is such a structure, then the idea of an external creator becomes less like an explanation and more like an unnecessary addition. It does not solve the mystery. It relocates it outside the system without actually reducing it. This is where arguments about necessity become important. Traditional theology often claims that God is a necessary being, something that must exist in all possible realities. But this raises a difficult question. If we can define necessity into existence for one entity, why not for the universe itself, or the mathematical structure underlying it? At that point, necessary existence risks becoming a label rather than an explanation. This is why some modern approaches suggest flipping the entire framing. Instead of asking why the universe exists, we might ask whether non-existence is even a coherent possibility for a mathematical structure that is internally consistent. If a structure is logically consistent, its existence may not require external justification at all. It is not caused. It is instantiated by the nature of mathematical consistency itself. This idea is not about removing wonder or reducing reality to something cold or empty. In fact, it does the opposite. It places reality inside a framework where complexity, order, and emergence are not imposed from outside, but arise naturally from the internal logic of the system. And this is where the perspective shifts from explanation as external agency to explanation as internal necessity. It also reframes what we mean by meaning itself. If the universe is not designed from the outside but generated from within a self-consistent structure, then meaning is not something inserted into reality, it is something that emerges within it through conscious beings who are part of that structure. In that sense, consciousness is not an anomaly. It is part of the unfolding of the system itself, capable of reflecting on the very structure that produced it. And that brings us to the final point of the entire discussion. The real shift is not from belief to disbelief, but from viewing reality as something that requires an external author, to viewing it as something that is self-generating, self-consistent, and deeply intelligible through mathematics and process. In that framework, the mystery does not disappear, but it changes form. It is no longer a gap waiting for an external answer. It becomes an internal depth that can be explored indefinitely, without ever requiring a final outside cause. And with that realization, we return to where we began, but with a very different perspective. The tools of reason and mathematics do not simply lead us away from questions of existence, they lead us into a deeper understanding of why those questions are far more complex than any single explanation can contain. If this exploration made you think differently, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with someone who enjoys questioning the foundations of reality.